Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Okay, Caroline, thank you. Okay, Hugh Irranca-Davies.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Minister. Minister, I wonder if I can ask you to expand on two particular items. One is what expectations you have of local authorities now to deliver on town centre transformation, both in response to COVID, but also the challenges that were there before as well. We saw earlier on this year the welcome announcement of, I think it was £90 million of investment in town centres. So how do you see that working? And also, if you could talk a bit about the Strategic Sites Acquisition Fund as well. If you start, because what I'm also going to ask you is, what does it mean for those that are not designated strategic sites or designated town centres? So, for example, you've got, in my own part of the world, Maesteg, population over 20,000, it falls within this normally. But then you've got the Garw Valley and the Ogmore Valley. They also have high streets, but a population spread across a valley of perhaps around 8,000. So what does it mean for those sort of communities that we will all have?
So there are three aspects to this, as you've rightly said, Hugh. So there's what we were trying to do already with our town centres, because you'll be aware, I know only too well, that some of our town centres are already struggling well before the pandemic for all kinds of obvious reasons. And what this has done, and again, I'm sorry to state the sort of blindingly obvious, but it's just accelerated the issue. It's moved more people more quickly online for shopping and so on. It's changed the pattern of the way people behave and so on. But we already knew that that's where it was going. So we were already working on a number of packages to increase footfall in town centres for social purposes, and to make sure that we absolutely optimised all of the accommodation that could be used for residential purposes, above shops and other types of buildings of that sort. What we've tried to do is work out, the most strategic of the hubs in order to try and give them a boost. So, not every single town in Wales is going to be one of those strategic market towns or whatever. I mean, it's just in the nature of it. That's not to say that the money isn't available to some extent everywhere that there's a project that's worth supporting, but we want specifically to boost some of our market towns and locally strategically important towns. And we also want to do something about the sort of urban blight that we've got associated with coming out of the old industrial revolution and into the new. So there are several packages on offer. There's strategic sites, one that you just mentioned. We've got property development funds. We've got stalled sites funding as well. So we've been working with local authorities to understand what's in their local development plans in terms of both housing and retail and employment sites, and to understand what the issues on those sites are, why aren't they coming forward in the way that you'd expect, and then to try and make funding available in a variety of ways, sometimes to the local authorities, sometimes to small and medium developers through the Development Bank for Wales, sometimes through social housing grant and so on, to try and bring those sites back into beneficial use, because we know that increased footfall, people moving back into our towns and living there and so on, is the way of the world. And so what we've been doing is we've also then got a set of funds which we were only slightly repurposing, just bringing forward slightly more quickly than we were before, to help businesses adapt to outdoor living, for example. So you'll be aware right across Wales there are businesses that have applied to the fund and have been able to develop an outdoor space with perhaps a canvas roof over it or whatever and to enable them to carry on trading. But we've tried to do that in a sustainable way on the basis that those are not short-term solutions, that these are solutions that may start off looking like a COVID response, but might actually end up being the way we live. So we've been trying to make sure that we're not putting in short-term one-off solutions that are there today and gone tomorrow, but actually are part of the overall plan to regenerate our various town centres. And just the last thing I wanted to say on that, Chair, if you don't mind, is just because I'm very aware of my own particular constituency in this and yours to some extent. By those, we also mean, of course, suburban shopping centres, because there'll be, satellite suburban shopping centres around a city that will be just as strategically important for their local communities. And I'm very frequently asked, oh, when you say a town, do you mean? But we do mean that, of course.
Minister, that's really helpful. But if I can ask just a short follow-up on this, because when we see announcements like the Town Centre Regeneration Funds, the Town Adaptation Fund in response to COVID, they're really welcome, but they tend to be focused on these strategic larger towns. And that could be a market town, or it could be, in my patch, of Bridgend, Pencorder, Porthcawl, whatever. And then everybody looks then at their own patch, where you as a government want to encourage people in Gilfach, the Garw, Ogmore, to work closer to home, to also have access to things that don't mean they have to travel far and so on. And they go, yeah, but we're slightly smaller. We're not quite a town. What would your message be to them and to local authorities across Wales if they feel they can't see the big packages that are tailored towards them?
Yes, so we've deliberately put small, it's possible to have quite a small grant and do this, so what we've been saying to people is, well, look into the future. This is part of our placemaking approach. So basically, we're saying to every single community in Wales, big and small, what is the nature of your place? What do you want it to be? What's the best way to secure its future? Is there a repurposed shop that could be used for a local employment hub? Is there an unsightly building that you'd like to get together and do something about with our vacant buildings fund or stalled sites fund or whatever, Hugh? So, all communities in Wales should feel that they have something to say about the way they want their community to look going forward, and they should be getting in touch with us to talk about what the best way of making sure they've got the funding in place to do that is. And the other thing is, we don't want to sort of race. Not everybody can have the anchor store for the region, but there are lots of independent things that you can do that will still make your place an attractive place to be, a social place, a place that people want to go and do whatever it is that they want to do in that space. And you'll know as well as I do that increasingly those are social things centered around cups of coffee and arts and culture rather than just retail. So absolutely, we want people to be able to do that, and that's very, very much part of our placemaking, our whole placemaking approach to this.
That's great, thanks, Minister. And could I just briefly ask you, how do you see the recovery subgroup of the Partnership Council playing a role in doing this?
Yeah, so we've worked very closely with WLGA and councils all the way through this pandemic. They've been amazing, actually, and officers at every level in local authorities have absolutely worked so hard and collaboratively, and it's been completely apolitical. We've all just pulled together in the right direction. So the recovery subgroup of the WLGA, which actually, if you look at its membership, is pretty much the whole WLGA, because everybody's interested in recovery, has been working very hard on a range of shared projects that we can put forward, both that are kind of shovel ready to restart the economy right now in this financial year, but also longer term over the next 5 to 10 years. What do those longer term plans look like in order to reboot our economy for that, for that green housing led, socially just economy that we all want?
Thank you, Minister. Okay, let me turn to housing, which does bear some relation to the earlier discussion we were having in terms of regeneration. But in light of our committee's recent report on inequality, I want to also look at those aspects about how we use your housing policy, how you use housing policy to tackle inequalities as well. So let me just ask you as an opener, what are you doing to increase the supply of social and affordable homes as part of the reconstruction? What has changed in your approach now?
So there are a few things that we've done that are pretty radically different. So the first is obviously during the pandemic. So I'm trying to separate out the COVID response to the longer term response, although inevitably they're a little bit enmeshed. So obviously as part of the response to the pandemic, we've absolutely housed everyone. So we had to do that for public health reasons, and we're very determined that the people housed during that crisis will stay housed. So we've been working very hard with the local authorities, invested large sums of money into both what we call phase 1 and phase 2. But can I just emphasize at that point that this is not linear. You don't have phase 1, it finishes, you go into phase 2. Phase 1 means the people who are presenting as homeless to the authorities, and we have a large number of those weekly presenting, who need to be sorted out immediately with somewhere safe to go, that they can, they can be safe for public health reasons as well as for ordinary humane reasons. And then we have phase 2, which is how to move people who are temporarily housed into longer term, more secure accommodation that's better suited to their longer term purposes. And for some people that will be supported accommodation with a range of services around it, and for others it will just be a secure permanent home. So as part of phase 2, we've got over 700 houses being built with that money, trying to get them up as fast as possible, and we're using all the things that the committee has spoken about many times in the past, and modern methods of construction, timber framed houses, Welsh supply chains, all the things that go with all of that. Probably an hour session, Sharon, on its own.
Yes.
But then coupled with that, of course, we've been looking longer term at changing the way, for example, we use public land. So you'll know that we established a land division, that we've changed the way that we look at Welsh Government owned land in Wales. Previously, we used to try and maximise the amount of money we got for that land in order to reinvest it into services. Now we've changed that to actually maximising what public good, if you like, because it's not necessarily the same as money. And for example, all Welsh Government land earmarked for housing now has 50% social housing on it as an absolute basic ask before we even start. And then on top of that, we've got a number of exemplar sites that we're looking at, where we're trying to show the whole community in Wales what can be done on a site if you really want to. So these are carbon neutral housing, very good green infrastructure, active travel built in to start, good proximity to employment, schooling, hospital, medical, etc. But also beautiful Welsh built houses with local supply chains, carbon passive, carbon neutral, and so on. So we've got several of those exemplar sites around Wales as well, that we're looking to work with our SME community in particular to show them what can be done. You don't always have to build that same old house you've been building for the last 15 years. You can build these. So, and then the last piece of that, of course, is that the lenders, we're working with the lenders as well. Lenders can be reluctant to lend on newfangled housing. So we want to de-risk that for them by helping our social landlords build these houses so they become commonplace. So then the lenders will come along and be happy to lend in our private sector. The last piece of that is we have just renewed the help to buy schemes, because not everybody wants social housing. Some people want to get their foot on the property ladder and so on. But of course we've coupled that with increased asks from the builders of what we expect. So only this morning I met with the House Builders Federation to say that if they build houses to social house standards, which are of course higher than private sector housing, which I do wish I could get more people in Wales to understand, then as the pandemic pans out and we do think the recession is going to deepen, we will of course be able to enable our RSLs and our councils to buy those houses off plan to keep the SME sector going. Whereas if they persist in building them to standards which are not good enough for social housing, then they will be themselves cutting themselves off from that route. So that went over very well this morning. Everybody took the point, and we've got a stakeholder group working at what do we mean by social house standards in this regard. So we're very aware that Welsh Government money levers all kinds of other improvements into other sectors as well as just the social housing.
And Minister, you're touching on their aspects of health inequalities as well, and new builds, if you get them right, can deliver all the wide benefits you've talked about, including health. But how do you get the focus right on the older housing stock that we all know that we have, typically in the private rented sector? And we've tried over the years to do so much to drive up the standards there. But even private self-owned accommodation in the older housing stock, if you look in rural areas or in the valleys, it can be pretty poor in terms of health outcomes as well. So what do you have? How do you as a minister say where you get the balance between focusing on new builds and clean sheet and actually regenerating and dealing with inequalities that are there within our existing stock, which many people are going to be stuck with for years to come?
Yeah, absolutely, Hugh. And again, sorry, Chair, long answers, I know, but they're just complicated sort of things to deal with. So I'll just go as fast as I can. So we have all the schemes you'll be familiar with. We've got Arbed and Nest and so on. They're all still running. During the pandemic, we've had people reluctant to, so they all can keep going. So if all of you can tell your constituents that, actually, that would be really helpful. because we have people saying, oh, is it okay for them to come in and change my boiler? It absolutely is. They've all been trained to be COVID safe and so on, but we do have people cancelling our bed appointments and so on because they're afraid and they think it's not okay. So if you could get that message out, that'd be good. So we've got those schemes still running. But much more importantly, we've just gone out on the optimized retrofit program. So what we're doing there, and actually in Rebecca Evans's recent announcements, we've got more money to put into this now as well. But we're basically going out to our social landlords and we're asking them to come forward with a range of different types of housing across Wales. So the two extreme examples I've been using just to make the point are the Victorian stone terracing in the mining towns of the valleys, as against the 1970s cavity wall ranch type housing you get in a large part of my constituency. Clearly a retrofit, one size fits all, will not fit both of those houses. So what we're asking them to do is come forward with a range of different houses on which they can trial out a range of different solutions to retrofit to get them up to EPC A. What will work, what won't, and so on. So we've just done the Welsh Housing Quality Standard we're right in the end, the dying days of that very successful programme. Largely that's been hugely successful, but we have had some learning from it. And one of the learnings is that if you clad with outside foam old stone buildings, they get condensation. And we've had some issues with that. We're working on solving them, but there have been issues. It's made it really obvious that one size doesn't fit all. And Chris Joffe's group, who worked with us, have been very keen to make sure that we do the right thing in the right place. So that optimized program is about finding the right technology for each type of house, but it's also about working with our colleges, FE colleges, which we're doing as part of the program, to understand what the skills are that are necessary to fit the technologies that bring, whatever the insulation is, whatever the heat source pump is, whatever it is, to get that to happen. To do the piece of work with the social landlords, that means that we can persuade the private sector lenders that this is a proper solution, and then to overskill the population that are fitting it in the public sector so that they're available for the private sector, so that if you are lucky enough to be a homeowner, or mortgaged or not, then you'll be able to get somebody with the skill to be able to bring your house up to standard. And then I think, whoever the next government is, will have to look very seriously at some behaviour modifiers, whether we should give council tax incentives or whatever to people who do bring their house up to EPCA, because at the moment, inexplicably, the market isn't doing that. So if you go to the trouble of getting your house to EPCA, it will not command a premium price to the house next door that hasn't, for reasons which are not clear to me. But perhaps we need to help the market do that for us as well, with some incentives. But that's when we know we need to do this first bit to understand what the technology and the skills piece looks like in order to get to the next bit. And that's following the recommendations of Chris Joffe's report that we had done to help us along the line. So we're working very hard on all of that. And of course, it's a very good way to kickstart the economy as well. It's a good green recovery project. So the more houses we can get into that, the faster we can go.
Okay, and finally, Minister, thank you very much for that. It's going to do, that's a whole session on its own, but thank you. I want to ask about the issues that particularly affect Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities, which is not just poor quality housing, but overcrowded housing as well. In the COVID reconstruction, how are we what are we going to do to deal with that issue as well? Because we could be in this for the long haul. Yeah. But there are issues that were there, as we touched on before, that were there before this even started. How do we deal with that?
Absolutely, Hugh. And really, in the end, the only way to deal with that is to build the social housing that we need. And so we just need to go an awful lot faster with the build on social housing than we've been able to do. And the pandemic has made that even more stark than it was before. And it's enabled us to kickstart it to some extent. And because we've been able to invest over the last 3 or 4 years in this new modern methods of construction, which you're all familiar with me banging on about, but which is still a pretty new thing, of course, we can now invest in those kinds of local supply chains, local economy, locally built houses, locally local talent, get our FE colleges to work alongside us with that. I hope you've all seen the maps. I shared them with all colleagues, but I'm happy to reshare them, Chair, of where the factories are across Wales, because they're beautifully geographically spread, which is really great as well. We're working with NRW and other timber suppliers to make sure that the supply chain for the timber materials, which most of them are made out of, is there. We're also working with our universities to make sure that we're bringing forward new technologies as fast as possible in terms of several of you have asked me questions about sheep's wool recently. Why aren't we using wool in insulation? The answer is we are. We're very happy to do that. What we need to do, though, is help those kinds of industries get into, well, sorry, Chair, to name a particular chain, but B&Q, builders merchants near you, when you go down there to buy your insulation, you need to be able to see Welsh sheep's wool and Welsh timber products and Welsh recycled products on those shelves, easy to buy. It shouldn't be something you have to look up specially because you're particularly interested. So it's working on all of that. So my colleague Ken Skates and his department have been working very hard on the supply chains for those industries to make sure that they get out there into the wider marketplace, while we show people what's possible to do with that. So the government de-risks the first 1,000 uses of it, and then after that it becomes a commonplace material. So we're working on both ends of that.
Thank you.
Mr.